Well, yeah, I also want to thank Richard for organizing this. It's been a very interesting and intense conversation on a lot of levels, and I'm grateful he invited me, and I'm hoping when he moves to Jerusalem that he'll stumble on someone with a lot of money, so we can meet for many more meetings in Jerusalem. So I'm not at all sure what's expected of me on this panel, but I have taken copious notes and have thought about it, the various themes and that have surfaced. And what I want to try to attempt to do is to reflect psychologically on some of the issues that have come up, and necessarily briefly, each one of them sort of, psychological haiku, if you want, elaborate, touch on themes that people have mentioned, but elaborate them maybe in some of my own ways. First, I want to start with the fact that there have been two mentions of nuclear weapons. Charles Cameron mentioned it yesterday, and Richard mentioned them this morning. And I think that's the great dread that we face when thinking about a group like ISIS or any apocalyptic group. I mean, Richard mentioned my 9/11 book, and it's always seemed to me that had bin Laden had the operational possibility of having a nuclear weapon on one of those planes that hit the towers, he would have. Now, he didn't, thank God, and it may be many decades before that kind of operational possibility occurs, but it's certainly not inevitable. Again, Richard mentioned having nuclear weapons in the world makes it possible for apocalyptic groups to carry out the kind of cataclysm that they imagine. And I think that's a dread that is worth constant reflection and constant discussion, and to try to tease out its meanings. I think in a way we're different human beings since the introduction of nuclear and increasingly other forms of ultimate destruction. But there's another issue, another perspective that wasn't mentioned that I want to push that point somewhat, which is that the danger of having nuclear weapons in the world and having a group, apocalyptic group, obtain them is what we have to fear and deal with. But the mere presence of nuclear and other ultimate weapons in the world evokes apocalyptic energies. And I think that's something that is often not noticed enough. Certainly, and actually, Richard, you mentioned the difference between the year 1000 and the Crusades, and I think that's a good example. So all of us, this is certainly an historically minded crowd, we know that the aspirations, the apocalyptic aspirations, are not new, but the fact that now with ultimate weapons in the world, we don't need God to destroy the world anymore. God becomes irrelevant, and having that in human hands evokes those ideas, those aspirations, those energies in groups, and pushes them, I think, more to the extreme. Now, this is not something that you could measure, but I think the acquisition, what does God do? God creates and God destroys, and we don't need God to destroy anymore. And I think that in some very profound ways has changed us as human beings, and it's something we definitely need to keep trying to think about. Now, relatedly, as T.S. Eliot says in the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, we can go with a bang or a whimper. And I think global warming, I was just telling Brenda that I'm beginning to do some work on global warming and political violence. This is the slow apocalypse. It's the end of the world by the seas becoming diseased and the air becoming polluted, and the fear is an apocalyptic fear, much slower. So that's the whimper. And I, as I said, begun some work. Even take ISIS. There was a drought in Syria between 2006 and 2011. Some 800,000 people fled from the northeast, mostly to Aleppo. Completely overwhelmed their their structures, institutional and political and economic and even spiritual sources and infrastructure. And that occurred in the context, of course, a brutal and a dictator willing to take advantage of it, give the abandoned lands to some of his cronies. In that context, then it became, after 2011, the civil war started, became a failed state. Jihadis flocked, hundreds and hundreds of groups flocked to Syria. And then, a little less than a year ago, ISIS emerged victorious. Now, there's not a causal relationship between the drought and the emergence of ISIS, but it's like a necessary but not sufficient cause. And I think that kind of sequence is the kind of sequence that we need to begin to think about with global warming. Take Bangladesh, lies about that far above sea level. Bangladesh has all kinds of jihadi groups. The Bhopal cyclone might be something of a harbinger of global warming, followed by the Pakistani genocide of the Bengalis, leading to terrible crisis, millions of people dying, and it could happen in a moment. You could have in a heartbeat. You could have scores of millions of people die with the effects, some of the indirect effects of global warming, and on the subcontinent, where two nations are armed to the teeth, unstable, particularly one, unstable democracies, armed to the teeth with nuclear weapons. So that's something where I'm going. Now, there was a lot of talk yesterday about ideology and what happens, and whether people, and some amusing discussion of Mark Sageman. I was became the defender of Mark Sageman, also known for many years. Very smart man, overstates his case. But it seems to me that in that debate, which was, I didn't disagree, I thought it was, some very good points made, there is something about the psychological experience of people who enter into these groups as being born again. And I think the Christian term really works. There's a psychological experience, a transformative psychological experience. One becomes a different kind of Muslim when you become a jihadi. And it is what the Christians mean when they talk about being born again. And if you think about it psychologically, it doesn't have to have a specifically religious meanings, even though it expresses itself in a religious context. And that born again, I think it will help us understand the intensity and the fervor of people who do cross over, who cross that line. They may be in unstable positions in their life, transitional moments. They're young, they're troubled, they're out of jobs, they're divorced, whatever. But having made that step, it provides a kind of a cohesive, it's a totalistic term I'm going to return to. Now, also, it's funny, no one used this term. I would just say that there's some talk of modernization and globalization, but one way to think about groups like ISIS is, and particularly ISIS, is a global countercultural movement. Maybe the most important countercultural movement in the world right now. And it has that, among many other meanings, it has that meaning as well. Now, I want to say something about the ethical sequence around dualisms and paranoia. I've written a lot about this. Certainly groups, actually, Richard, my last book was, my 11th book, my last book was called The Fundamentalist Mindset, which I wrote about half of, and David Redless has a wonderful paper in it, I try to name in that what the 4 or 5 dimensions, aspects of fundamentalism, but certainly dualism and paranoia are really essential, and there's some important consequences of that. The way they work together, the dualism and the Manichaeisms, along with the paranoia. in sort of naming the steps. The first is the construction of the other is evil. And it's very, very important, even in secular terms like the Tamil Tigers, the other is evil, embodies evil. And usually these groups, and certainly ISIS in specifically religious terms, carries all the meaning and baggage, we might say, of that ideas of evil. That in turn, having constructed the other as evil, that in turn leads to the experience of feeling victimized by that evil other. So it stirs a good deal of paranoia. Now, I would say as that process continues, the construction of the other becomes an apocalyptic other, and the crucial concept here is totalism. And I think in all this thinking about these terms psychologically or politically or in any way, we can see aspects or beginnings or manifestations of this process in a lot of arenas. But it's when the process gets totalized that it becomes toxic. And totalism is actually a term that Erickson first started. I think he may have taken his Annals End was Anna Freud, but he has it in his wonderful book Young Man Luther, in the shaping of Martin Luther. A book that profoundly influenced me, but Lifton, Robert J. Lifton, my guru, has written about, probably more than anybody, beginning with his Thought Reform book and up through his talking about the Nazis and all the stuff about nuclear weapons, and including his 1995 book, The Genocidal Mentality, which I would encourage you to read. And it's that tendency to totalize that makes dualisms, makes this construction of the other as evil, makes that experience of paranoia, makes it so profoundly dangerous because it gets absolutized and totalized. It leads to the sense of the ethical right to dispense with the other. Because that other embodies evil, and because that other, but my experience of that other is that it's a profound danger to me, I then have that ethical, and I think the ethics here is very important. Now, in its most totalized form, as with ISIS, it becomes not only an ethical right, it becomes an obligation. And once it becomes an obligation, then violence becomes a moral act. And killing, the final step in this process, it makes the killer a savior, which is why people commit violence for all kinds of idiosyncratic reasons. They steal, they rob, they murder for personal and say idiosyncratic reasons. But you don't commit genocide except in the act of what you experience as a moral act, as serving a higher purpose, saving history, saving my race, saving the nation, whatever. And the ethics, it's very important to remember. Let's get to the next page here. Am I going on too long?
No, but it's all interesting. Let's see if you can wrap up. There will be more occasion to discuss.
Yeah, I'm not quite ready to wrap up here. Related to the violence, and I think we constantly need to think about why the violence, what does it mean, how do people experience it, how do they justify it, how do they work it out, how do they explain to themselves that it's right, that it's the right thing to be doing. And Freud wrote about the narcissism of small differences, first in 1914 and then in Civilization's Discontents in 1930. It's a very, the fact that we're much more likely to kill our neighbors than we are some distant enemy, and we experience our neighbors as more dangerous. It's actually a very limited discussion, the narcissism of small differences, and entirely phenomenological. And I think the way to understand it is with Coates' idea of narcissistic rage. I worked with Coates, I wrote his biography. And the key thing is that we experience small differences in the context of similarity. And those small differences are are experienced as flaws in our own narcissistic universe. And therefore, it diminishes our capacity for empathy for the other, and the small differences become huge, and they threaten our own sense of self, which in turn is part of that process of justifying the violence. So, finally, I wanted to say something about time. I can't stop without time. Yesterday, there was talk about Rome, talk about the Antichrist. I would add the Caliphate, the idea of the Caliphate. What is it? What are its boundaries? Where does it come from? Which century are you talking about, right? And all of these discussions show this mixture of concrete and it's both concrete and mystical at the same time. And that's one of the things that can make it sort of baffling. As a psychoanalyst, when I see that kind of mixture, my ears open up. And it's in a curious way, it relates to this sense of, it collapses past and present, past and future, and time changes. I was taking the cab to the airport yesterday, or I guess 2 days ago, and saw a great big billboard with a picture of George Clooney. I actually don't know what it was for, but it said,
new movie.
Remember the future. Right, remember the future.
Tomorrowland.
Oh, Tomorrowland, okay. So, Freud said in 1895 that hysterics suffer from reminiscences. I was thinking jihadis suffer from history. And it's a very peculiar sense of time that Philip Reif wrote a wonderful book in 1962 called Freud, The Mind of the Moralist. And he makes a distinction between kairotic time and chromatic time. Chronos is regular, predictable. We wouldn't have the modern without a sense of the chromatic, of time being in perfectly understandable, comprehensible units that we can measure to the infinite degree, right? We wouldn't have planes, bridges, cities. We wouldn't have the life as we know it. There's also kairotic time. That's Freud. Freud's version of kairotic time was the Oedipus complex. Not a very useful idea anymore, but it was that there was a moment in childhood which was around which everything else crystallized. It became the defining experience that was a drag on the rest of life. And I think if we think of that in more contemporary terms, it's trauma. And there are various times. It doesn't have to be between 4 and 6, and it doesn't have to lead to the superego and all the things that he said in 1923. But there are traumatic moments. Those are kairotic moments. Those are the black holes of life. Those are the black holes of individual experience. That's what I deal with all the time with my patients. But also there's a collective analog of that. And what it leads to is this sense of a sense of diseased sense of the past, which then gets idealized as an attempt to cure and then projected forward. So that's why the confusion, what is the caliphate? What is the future of the caliphate? Where does it come from? And it comes from a truly diseased sense of history that can be baffling, but also needs to be understood in this to attempt to it's an attempt at healing, to construct this visionary, idealized future that comes out of this sense of the past. Thank you.